It's an essential industry. It's the energy transition is going to be very metal intensive. The world needs metals and mined commodities, but we also see that people are wary of it, and we think that the transparency that we bring, both on the pricing, but also on the ESG credentials of a particular transaction, will really help.
This is AssetRush Talk, where we talk with the pioneers of the financial industry. And here today, I'm with Trevor from Open Minerals. Trevor, please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Trevor Skidmore, and I work for Open Mineral, which is a platform that's bringing transparency to commodities markets.
So Trevor, what drives you?
I spent my whole career working in the mining industry. I've done a lot of different roles focusing on different assets across the world. And there's always been an element of frustration with how opaque commodities markets are, and as a result, how difficult it is to finance them, to insure them, to see accurate pricing. And at Open Mineral, we're using digital tools to change this, and we think it benefits the whole industry.
So what were your first points of action? How did you come about this platform? What did you do so far?
So the platform was established about 5 years ago. I only joined this year. And I saw what they were doing and thought this was something that could be really useful for the industry. And I can look back at every role I've done. I've been working in the industry for 14, 15 years, where this platform, if it was working and operational and liquid, would be helpful to every single one of those roles. And all of my colleagues feel the same way. We've all left roles in the mining industry, in the metals trading, because we think that these digital tools can make this better.
So what would be a great example for that?
So one of the things we struggle with in commodity trade is financing material, getting trade finance material. There's a few specialized banks that do it, but the rest of the sort of broader financial ecosystem shies away from upstream commodities because of how opaque markets are. It's difficult to calculate pricing. It's difficult to know exactly what you're financing. It's shipped as a black powder, and until it's sampled and assayed and run through, the pricing structure is quite complicated, and you need to calculate it. So banks have historically shied away from it, and it's a huge opportunity. These are commoditized products. They're essential to modern life. Trades are high value, and they're completed quickly. But securing financing for it's very difficult, and we think a lot of that is around just how opaque the market is. It needs a lot of work and a lot of knowledge to understand it. And at Open Mineral, we've got a digital toolkit, so anyone financing these flows can look at it. You can see exactly what the product is, what it's worth in different markets at different times, and you can track where it is along the supply chain. So we think there's a way for financiers to get more interested in markets that they've shied away from just because they're opaque and they're complicated to understand.
Yeah, the transparency is missing for them, so you certainly increase that. You help them with that transparency and also with the execution of these investments.
Yeah, so we have an execution services as well that we offer. So essentially it's a business-to-business platform, but we offer through Open Mineral Execution Services a full middle and back office solution. There are certain economies of scale there that can make it more effective for our customers, and particularly for some of the smaller mining companies so I used to work at a big mining company, and we had a marketing team in Shanghai, in Beijing, in Seoul, in Tokyo, an operations hub in Singapore, millions of dollars of overheads, which is great for a big mining company. But for a small mine, you don't have those tools available to you. The overheads are too much. So we offer that as a sort of marketing as a service for smaller mining companies, and we really think, and we've had a lot of progress speaking to counterparties, that this helps them connect with the sort of global commodities markets in a way that would have been very expensive for them to do beforehand.
Okay, so where are these mining companies come from? Where are your clients come from that use the platform?
So, I mean, we're business to business, so we do the production side and the consumption side. And the production side is predominantly in South America, also in Africa. We're seeing some interest out of Canada as well, and Australia. And commodities consumption it's Asia driven, mainly China, but Japan, India, as well.
It's Asia driven mostly, and mostly driven by the producing countries.
It's a business-to-business platform. We have clients on both sides of the transaction. So we have the producers, who are the whole mining companies, and base metals and precious metals predominantly mined in South America, Africa, Canada, and Australia. And on the consumption side, China and Japan are the big leaders. We're seeing increased consumption in India as well.
Okay, and the investor base for your platform also comes from these countries?
We've got a broad investor base. So we have some investors who are, I guess, some traditional tech VC funds based out of Europe. We've got one VC fund in from China. We've got a sovereign wealth fund from Abu Dhabi as well, who invested last year. Who are, we're doing a lot of work with them to see what we can do in Abu Dhabi to develop some commodities infrastructure there to support trade. A lot of the way commodity markets are developing, Africa is going to become a lot more important, and there's a potential for Abu Dhabi to sit there as a good hub for some of that material.
How do you see the future of that market developing, and how do you add to it?
I think commodity markets are at the moment quite old-fashioned. A lot of trade is done by people who go and meet other people in a room and negotiate things, spend a lot of time on aeroplanes, a lot of time in hotels. To me, it's the way that, for example, stockbroking was done 10, 20 years ago, and a lot of that's moved to digital platform, digital exchange. So we see it moving that way. We see the production companies like it, they like the transparency of it, they like how easy it is, and on the consumption side as well, it's easier to execute a trade.
So what would you expect, or how would you like the future to change for your benefit of the business, and what do you think has to happen in that market in the future?
I think what we'd like to see is a lot of standardization. So at the moment when you're selling, say, copper concentrates, there's a myriad of different contractual frameworks that you can use, different terms depending on the counterparties, depending on the regions. And I think we'd like to see, and we're doing what we can to drive this change as well, a lot more standardization that makes it easier for everyone. It makes it easier for the producers, the consumers, the shippers who sit in the middle of this, and the financiers who finance the whole flows. A lot more standardization would just make each transaction much easier to do. You haven't got to do all of the sort of the overheads per transaction. Once you've learned about how the trade flow works, you can do a transaction from Colombia to Chile, sorry, from Colombia to China, or from Peru to Japan, or Australia to Indonesia. It will all be the same.
So how far did you come in terms of that standardization and with your platform?
Okay, so our platform essentially replicates what would have been done before in paper contracts and Excel spreadsheets and things like that. So we have a front end where users can go on and they can input pricing terms, and say, I talk about copper concentrate a lot because it's the one we do the most of and it's the biggest market. But the same would be true for zinc or lead. But the ultimate price that you pay is a combination of how much metal is in it, what you're going to pay for each of those metals, the time period that you pay them for, and certain deductions for freight. So we have an online platform where you can go and look at that. You can input all of those, and you get one number out of the bottom. It makes it very easy if you're the seller to compare bids that have been submitted on quite different terms.
Yes.
It comes out as one number, which is much easier for people to understand.
Sure. Completely understand. Now, what are the effects for investors on that side? You work now with Gen 2 on some nodes to set those up, to set certificates up. So how does that help you?
With Gen 2 to basically try and introduce commodity trade finance to a broader range of lenders who may have historically been deterred from commodities markets because they're opaque and they're difficult to understand. We think the platform can do a lot to introduce that. We're also doing an awful lot of work on ESG monitoring that's become very important for everyone in the value chain, particularly for investors who want to know what they're getting in terms of. So with our platform, you can see for each individual transaction what the emissions are at each level of the supply chain. So if you're a producer and you connect to a smelter who's going to buy your product, you can see what their emissions are and what therefore your scope 3 emissions exposure is before you do the trade. So as well as seeing the pricing you're going to get, you see the scope 3 exposure. We think that there's an investor class that like that as well. Commodity trade finance is difficult. Mining is seen as from an ESG perspective, a difficult industry. It's an essential industry. It's the energy transition is going to be very metal intensive. The world needs metals and mined commodities, but we also see that people are wary of it, and we think that the transparency that we bring, both on the pricing, but also on the ESG credentials of a particular transaction, will really help. Maybe as this transition in the future, you'll see that there's lower cost of financing for more environmentally friendly transactions, and that was a really interesting way for the industry to go.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I clearly see you expand the investment universe with that. You opening it up to a new clientele, to a new investor base as well, and standardize it from that view. And that's certainly important for the industry, for all of our lives, to actually develop and into the future and make future technologies also possible, and the development of many countries and people with that. Now, tell me a bit, where do you see that growth or that impact the most?
Metals are essential to modern life, and the more we modernize, the more metals we need.
Sure.
There's more electrification, it needs more copper, you need more aluminium to run lighter weight cars. Metal intensity is increasing with modern life. And there's a slight conflict that the mining industry is seen as dirty, and metals are essential. So the greater the transparency is, the more we can do to demonstrate that the mining industry, actually a lot of it isn't that dirty. And mines are modern, they're safe, and the more transparency there is through the supply chain can give somebody who is buying metals, for example, that the mines that they're buying from are clean and safe, and not from the sector of the industry that is less conscious of that.
Yeah, a lot more comfort, a lot more transparency on that side. I clearly see that. And I also think that investors react to that, and also the consumers react to that. So that's certainly a big part there. So now, where do you think that your platform maybe opposes with the traditional world of commodity trading? Where do you think that this has the most impact, or how do you see that change happening?
Most people that we speak to when we're trying to develop interest in the platform, they all think it's a good idea, and that's whether you speak to producers, consumers, financiers, ultimate end users of products. They all like this. The challenge is that you're trying to break down very established relationships, established flows, established ways of doing business. Commodities have been traded the way they are for centuries, and trying to change that, it's not enough to change the mind of one person in that supply chain. Yes. You have to change the miner, the smelter, the shipper, the bank, any intermediary there. They all have to get on board with not only the platform's the way to go, but this platform's the way to go. So that's the challenge with it. Most people think this is a good idea, and it's been welcomed by the industry and investors as well. People are always excited about this and think this is a good thing. It's a huge industry, and if you can do some things to make it a bit clearer, people like that. The challenge is getting everyone on board at the same time for the same transaction.
Sure, I can understand. This is certainly a big challenge, especially in such an old industry, with also very established players. But I think you certainly work on that standardization, that need. So that certainly makes a lot of sense. That market is growing constantly. Do you see a limit to that growth? Do you see or do you see more efficiency that solves the problem?
Metals consumption is continuing to grow. A lot of metals goes into infrastructure, and we're seeing big infrastructure development in the developing world. And in the more developed world, it's a bit different. Commodity metals are not like oil and gas. Once you consume them, you don't need more and more and more. You're essentially building a stockpile that can be reused. But the reuse supply chains are also difficult and also opaque, and there's certainly a role for platform in there. So in terms of the growth of open mineral, there's all sorts of ways we can develop it. And I think the first thing to remember is that these markets are enormous, in that a relatively small penetration rate is still a very big business.
Sure.
We're also focusing on some of the more critical battery materials.
Yes.
Lithium's one at the moment which is getting a lot of investor and media attention. And these markets are slightly different. They're not as well established. You haven't got these sort of long-term relationships between miner and smelter that go back for decades. It's a new market. Producers are new, consumers are new. And you know, the platform there offers a much easier way to connect where there isn't this established flow as it is.
Yeah, to interact and also open, of course, these markets up and help them to develop. So that's really great.
Yeah. This is all about connecting, connecting mining assets with a global marketplace.
Yes.
And a platform is a low cost and transparent way to do that.
That's a wonderful thing. Now, tell us a bit about the ecosystem itself. Like, how do you want the ecosystem to develop in your markets? And then we can also talk a bit about AssetRush and how this can open up to, of course, many more interesting parties and people in the ecosystem there.
Yeah, so what we're doing at AssetRush is predominantly about introducing this to the financial community.
Yes.
And broadening this to a range of people who may not have considered it before because of all the reasons that we've talked about. And that's what we're doing at AssetRush, and we're looking forward to having conversations with financiers or their clients who are like the idea of getting exposure to metals, but don't have a lot of maybe the right technical understanding or the right commercial understanding to be able to get comfortable with the investment.
Yes. Now, the ecosystem of investors today, what is it today? What are the investors typically today?
So on a trade finance side, it's very much trade finance banks. These are established banks, predominantly European, who've been doing this for a long time.
Yeah.
And so we think that certainly if you're financing commodity trade flows, you've got commoditized, high-value product. Trades are completed quickly, and they're between reliable counterparties. When we put these trades together, you literally have to go out and beg for financing.
Yeah.
And you think, well, why? I mean, the few banks that have the pedigree in this and have the internal knowledge are enjoying some good returns for very little risk. And we think there's a broader ecosystem that can get involved with that market if they have the understanding and the visibility to be able to do that. And Open Minerals platform helps them do that.
Yeah, I think Open Minerals really belongs to AssetRush. It really will make, so to say, open new fields as well in the community, and also certainly will have quite some reactions within the AssetRush ecosystem. Okay, now the ESG perspective on this whole market must have a great impact. So what can you tell us about that?
We think that the ESG impact does have a huge impact, and a lot of the people we speak to about the platform are really, really excited about this aspect of it. In that, there's a lot of focus at the moment on monitoring Scope 3 emissions, and if you're a mining company doing this, your Scope 1 and Scope 2, things you control, are quite clear. Scope 3 is very difficult because you really are at the top of a supply chain, and once it leaves your mine gate, it knows where it goes. And what our platform does is enable enable users that once they're looking at people to sell to, what their Scope 3 exposure is of that trade, and that's very difficult to calculate. And there are companies who've made commitments to calculate this and to report this, but at the moment lack the framework to be able to do that. And we can do this. We do it as part of our platform service as a. You can see the Scope 3 exposure before you execute the trade. We can also do it as a consulting basis for customers looking to sort of historically report what their Scope 3 emissions were last year, for example. We can match up the Scope 3 emissions based on the destinations of the product. And there's a lot of work that goes into that.
I guess,
the amount of data you have to collect and calculate and structure it in a way that it is usable. Scope 3, tons of carbon equivalent per ton of copper, or per ton of copper concentrate, or per ton of material moved. The platform can do all of those things, and we've already done the work. And it's just it's a digital way of being able to get the data out in a form that's useful to you.
Well, I guess that's a lot of value that you provide there, not only to the investors and to the product itself, but actually also to the whole industry. So that's wonderful. So AssetRush is coming up. You will be presenting there. You will be talking about, so to say, your endeavors, and tell us a bit what you expect from the people at AssetRush.
I think we talk to commodity trade financiers a lot, and we're looking forward to speaking to a slightly different investor base about commodities markets, and being able to connect people who haven't necessarily had the exposure with the metals markets before to those markets. We've got a great team at Open Mineral who have all come from mining houses, trading houses. We know the industry extremely well, and we'd love to, through AssetRush, to have a way to connect investors who are interested in this but lack the expertise or the knowledge, and be able to use both our platform and our sort of in-house expertise to match those together.
Wonderful. Now, my two takeaways from our talk is now transparency and standardization is really important to this market. It actually can help not only in the development of that market, but actually it will help us with the development in many, many aspects.
If you're looking to get exposure to upstream metal markets and want a transparent and de-risked solution, get in touch with Open Mineral.